I don't know about you, but this encounter on the road to Emmaus is one of my favorite passages in all of the Gospels. It's so rich with the kind of tenderness of Jesus and the hope that Jesus brings to us in his resurrection. There's three things that I'd like to consider with you today. One is how, like the disciples, so many of us are prone to seek our consolations in earthly things, when God desires to console us and give us hope in and through grace and God's own presence. The second, how profoundly we can be blocked from receiving consolation, even when it's right underneath our noses. And third, the wonderful sacrament of ordinary life, and the way in which each of us, in the simplest things, as simple as breaking bread together, can find and know the living God. So first, the scenario. That first morning of the resurrection, there's a writer, Ronald Rolheiser, a Canadian priest, who suspects that it's Cleopas and his wife Mary who are on the road together. And we know the events that have taken place. Mary and Cleopas, this married couple, have been followers of Jesus. Mary probably was with Mary, the mother of Jesus, at the crucifixion. Who was Jesus for them? Jesus was a teacher, one who was revealing to them a whole new way of living and loving and being in relationship to God. Jesus was a friend. Jesus was the Messiah. They had hoped to set them free and to redeem Israel. So naturally, we can only imagine how devastated they were in the events that took place that Friday, as were all the disciples. And given the amazing news that had just been told to them about the empty tomb, about the angels and their message, about the news that the disciples had seen Jesus, we might wonder, why in the world are they heading away from Jerusalem, away from their community? They must be beset by confusion, maybe a little bit of overwhelm. And why, of all places, are they heading to Emmaus? I didn't know this until I read this article by Father Rolheiser, but apparently Emmaus was a Roman spa town about a day's walk from Jerusalem. It was a little bit more like Las Vegas than Disneyland, okay? Not necessarily some place you'd want to bring your kids. It was a place where the Romans went to be pampered, to indulge themselves in a bit of hedonistic life. Not exactly the kind of place you'd expect the disciples to be going on the morning of the resurrection. We can only imagine, though, that Cleopas and his wife Mary had had enough, that in their grief, their exhaustion, their disappointment, they wanted to numb themselves. They wanted to get away from it all for a while and forget that all this had ever happened, and maybe even somehow get back to the lives they were living before they met Jesus in the first place, before he awakened in them this sense of desire and expectation. Jesus, who had spoken to their hearts and tapped into their dreams and hopes for a life better than the one they were living, a life free from worry because it would be grounded in faith in God, a life freed from the burden of oppression by the Roman occupation and crushing taxes, a life of spiritual fulfillment and peace and joy. This is what Jesus had awakened in them. And this is what they felt like was dashed and crushed that Friday, just days before. He had raised their expectations only to leave them empty. So how can we blame them for wanting to get away from it all for a little while, to drown their sorrows, to seek worldly relief and consolation? But then how tender and how loving the risen Christ is. How amazing it is that Jesus, that morning of his resurrection, seeks out and finds his followers, his friends, and his message is one of consolation. Peace be with you. I am not dead, but living. Have hope. And just as our loved ones who go before us must desire from the communion of saints to give us consolation after they've passed from this life, so Jesus wants to gather them together to celebrate and to give them new hope. While just a week before, Jesus was limited to being one place at a time, in Christ's resurrection, his presence is not limited by time or by space, but only by our imagination. Now, people wonder, why wasn't Jesus immediately recognizable to these people who loved him so much? People who knew him, who grew up with him, who'd spent every minute of every waking hour for 3 years at least with him. I think there's 2 reasons. One, if you've lost anyone very close to you, you know that in extreme grief, it's very hard to recognize anything familiar or to really receive consolation, because our worlds have been turned upside down and nothing seems the same. The second reason, there's no way that Jesus could have undergone this radical experience of crucifixion and death and burial and resurrection without being profoundly changed, spiritually, physically, metaphysically. There are examples throughout literature, and if we watch movies and things like that, we'll see examples where people like Odysseus. How many of you have read the Odyssey or know the story? Raise your hands. The story of the Odyssey, okay? You know, Odysseus is away off to war for 20 years, 10 years of the Trojan War, 10 years trying to return to his wife. When he finally returns to Ithaca, nobody recognizes him except his old nursemaid, who recognizes him by a scar on his leg. His experiences have so changed him. And maybe we've been like that in our lives, or we know people who have been. People who are returning from war and have seen things that would make many of us just completely crumple. People who have experienced terrible accidents or trials and come out on the other side. There is a profound change that some of us experience in life, and we are unrecognizable to those close to us. And yet, there is something essentially the same. Jesus is so overjoyed at his own resurrection, he can't wait to share his consolation with his disciples. And he sort of plays with them a little bit as he walks along, doesn't he? But then, as they gather for that meal at the end of the day, the simplest act of community and worship, giving thanks for God's providence, blessing that bread, breaking it, and sharing it with one another. Then the disciples recognize him. And if the disciples felt their hearts burning with energy and consolation and new hope, imagine the risen Christ's experience of that simple meal. Imagine the experience of coming back from death to give thanks to God, that everything he had been promised by his Father was redeemed. The promise that he would be returned to life, even after being crushed in suffering. The promise of God that he would be resurrected and restored. Imagine his own heart filled at that moment with gratitude for the grace of being reunited with friends and of the joy of bringing them consolation. To maybe experience for himself what he had been for so many others, the blessing of healing and sustenance and the return to community, the return to life. So given the abundance and celebration of that moment, that Eucharist and communion, it's no surprise that Mary and Cleopas run back to Jerusalem 7 miles to return and share their good news with their friends. They chose to open their hearts to the grace and consolation God wanted to give over and above the relief that the world might have provided, temporary relief in that Roman spa town. My sisters and brothers, when we gather for Eucharist this afternoon, communion and Eucharist, may our hearts burn with the same sense of consolation and energy and new life, and in all the daily sacraments of our lives. And today, as we celebrate Mother's Day tomorrow, we think of how the mothers in our midst are very much the sacraments, the symbols, the reflections of that risen Christ and his joy, gathering up his children, healing them, nourishing them, and bringing them back to life.